Welcome to TCM. I'm Ben Mankiewicz. Our guest programmer tonight, young filmmaker, I think has a big future. Is it Steven? Did I get that right?
Steven's fine.
Steven Spielberg joins us. Thanks for being here. Thanks for doing this. Great to talk to you.
Great to talk to you too, Ben. I've been a fan of this show since April of '94.
Yeah, well, I know you have, and your support is does not go unnoticed. Very appreciated, so thank you. The three movies that you have picked tonight, really interesting set of films. We're going to open with Man Who Shot Liberty Valance from 1962, directed by John Ford. And then we'll have A Walk in the Sun, was Milestone's great war picture. And we'll wrap it up with Francois Truffaut's Day for Night. We're starting with Liberty Valance, John Ford. Anybody who's seen The Fabelmans now knows the role that John Ford played in your life.
Yes. First of all, I was a complete Fordophile. I think probably ever since I saw, when I was about 10 years old, in a movie theater, The Searchers. I had to actually take a little money out of the cookie jar because my parents thought it was too violent, wouldn't let me go. And Haddon Heights was close to our house. I walked a mile to the theater and spent my 35 cents, got in, and saw my first John Ford picture. I've been a fan of his ever since.
More than a fan, it would seem that his movies, I mean, they are some of the films that really made an imprint on you as a director.
They did. Thanks to television, John Ford films were widely seen in both New Jersey and Arizona on The Late Show and The Late Late Show. That's how you saw pictures in those days. And I learned my P's and Q's from John Ford just watching The Late Show.
The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance is routinely, I don't know if you agree with this, referred to as the last great John Ford film.
I agree with that. I also think it is one of the few John Ford films that I think has attained a cult. It's become a cult classic. It somehow has stood. All his films have stood, the test of time. But there's something always modern about The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance.
Well, I mean, he's famous, as you know, for shooting on location, more often than not in Monument Valley. Not here, not in The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, on the lot at Paramount. Makes that an exceptional John Ford film just by that fact alone.
And I don't, hold Liberty Valance up to John Ford's cinema. I don't hold it up to They Were Expendable. I don't hold it up to The Informer or to The Grapes of Wrath or How Green Was My Valley or even The Searchers. Those films had a kind of location cinematic novelty. No one had ever seen compositions like that before. This is John Ford telling a story based on performance and based on his strong screenplay and just based on, I think, a kind of simplicity in a visual style. And so it's his least adorned film visually for me.
But that doesn't take away from your connection to it or how much it means to you.
No, because it is a powerful story. It is one of the most powerful stories about a bully, essentially. Liberty Valance, played by Lee Marvin, is someone that has terrorized a small town, terrorizes Marshall Link, played by Andy Devine, who is more interested in a 37-ounce steak,
or two 37
or even
ounces.
two, than basically marshaling the town and bringing law and order. So there is no law and order. And of course, John Wayne's character, Tom, and I don't think John Wayne has ever been given a simpler name in his entire career. It's usually Ethan or Sean, but not Tom. But he plays Tom, and he's out of town a lot. So Liberty has his way with people.
And it is a story about the modernization of the West and the end of people like Liberty Valance and John Wayne's character, Tom. And irrigation is coming and the train is coming. So there's a modern quality to this Western that Ford's previous Westerns deliberately lacked.
Well, the story takes place in 1910.
With the first version, and then much of it is flashback earlier than that.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't think Western when I think of The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. Everybody is wardrobed. I believe the only nomination the film got was actually for wardrobe. But the film just feels less like a Western and more like a social statement, more about justice. It's really a story about a man, a brilliant man, played by Jimmy Stewart, who plays Ransom Stoddard. And it's about the balance between law and taking responsibility for the justice that needs to be meted out.
Steven, great stuff. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Talk more after the movie, but here it is. From 1962, directed by John Ford. John Wayne, Jimmy Stewart, Lee Marvin, Vera Miles, and a wonderful supporting cast. The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. I am back with the man who programmed tonight's film, director Steven Spielberg. Can't thank you enough for being on our air tonight and all the support you've given to TCM throughout the years.
It's an honor to be here.
Well, it's an honor to have you. So, the man who shot Liberty Valance, that wonderful, not quite the last scene, but that line we get at the end after we come out of the flashback when the legend becomes fact. Print the legend. Filmmaking is myth-making, right? And our image of the Old West and what it was and how people behaved is almost entirely driven by men like John Ford, right? And then the people he put in his movies, right? He created what we think of as the Old West.
Well, John Ford was certainly one of the greatest filmmakers of all time and one of the most significant influencers of stories about the Old West. But when I think about John Ford, I also have to think about Raoul Walsh. I have to also think about Howard Hawks. Henry Hathaway made some great westerns. Anthony Mann. Winchester 73, one of my favorite westerns that Anthony Mann directed.
With Jimmy Stewart, of course.
It was. You have to bring them all together. Ford was a leader of that particular pact. But it was a time when the Western dominated the culture in terms of an audience interest to see a certain genre. Everybody wanted to see Westerns. Television then made so many Westerns, you know, from Bonanza to Gunsmoke, you know, Wanted Dead or Alive, Steve McQueen's first TV show, on and on and on, that audiences turned to TV to watch their Westerns and turned away from movie screens for their Westerns. And I really think the great turn came with Star Wars. That Star Wars was the beginning of a new kind of cultural phenomenon that gave rise to the superhero movies. And the Westerns can be found on TCM and occasionally in the movie theaters.
Right, so we know from The Fabelmans, which I adored, the influence that John Ford had on you. I did not know until I saw that movie that a young Steven Spielberg had met John Ford. It's like you were holding that in your back pocket your entire life until you made this movie.
That's right. I told the story to friends of mine. My friends have grown up with me hearing about my first and only meeting with John Ford. But it was one of the scariest meetings I've ever had, you know, because he was really tough. He was a tough guy. And he didn't cut me a break. You know, I came in there wanting to be a movie director. His assistant or secretary in those days told him that I was sitting out in the office for an hour and a half waiting to meet him.
Like 20 or something?
I was like 16. At the time. And it was before I was in college. I was in high school. And I was visiting LA, and a friend, just like in our movie, introduced me to, not a friend of mine, a friend of my uncle, introduced me to Jack Ford. I didn't even know who it was. They took me in an office, and they said, "You're going to meet the greatest director in the world. His name is Jack." But they left out the last name, assuming I would know who I was about to meet. Unlike my movie, which has all of John Ford's posters on the outer office, there was no posters in the real outer office of John Ford. So I was escorted into the room, and the second I saw him, I knew exactly who he was. And he basically gave me a bollocking, but the bollocking contained inside this great intimidator was some of the greatest advice anybody has ever given me. And it was 10, 12 years later, when the trauma wore off and the PTSD waned, where I realized what he was saying to me was a kindness, a beautiful, generous offering of advice about composition.
Well, that moment in The Fabelmans is a wonderful scene. And I'm glad to hear so much of it was true. So, all right, Steven, great stuff. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Stay with us. Steven and I return momentarily with Louis Milestone's 1945 picture, A Walk in the Sun. It's next on TCM. Hello and welcome to TCM. I'm Ben Mankiewicz. My guest tonight, he's programmed our slate of films, Steven Spielberg. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Up next, 1945, Louis Milestone, the second film in his war trilogy. This is A Walk in the Sun, set in the Allied invasion of Sicily. The picture, though, came out just as the fighting ended in World War II. And it is one of the most powerful war films to come out during the war. And I haven't asked you this, but I presume a significant influencer for you for Saving Private Ryan.
When Tom Hanks and I decided to do Private Ryan together, one of the first films I showed Tom was William Wellman's Battleground and Louis Milestone's A Walk in the Sun. Not that they were my two favorite war movies, because there's a lot of war films that I really admire, but there was something that was so independent of the kind of rank and file of the approach of shooting war that was contained in A Walk in the Sun. It's really rather esoteric in a wonderful way, in a good way.
Yes, there is a spiritual quality to it, mostly through John Ireland's character.
Yes.
Who's writing wistful letters to his sister and saying them out loud, or at least thinking them out loud. But that idea of a platoon, of getting to know a bunch of different guys thrown together who would likely not have known each other under other circumstances, much of that is in Saving Private Ryan.
Yeah, Saving Private Ryan, it was essential because we had to let everybody get to know the squad. And so everybody has a moment in Saving Private Ryan where the characters are illuminated and spotlight hits them and you get to know who they are as people, not just as soldiers. And that was very important. That was also essential with a lot of war movies where you got to know the crew, you got to know the squads. It was nothing new, but I think A Walk in the Sun is unique in that it was written, the book was written by Harry Brown. And Harry Brown and Robert Rossen, who adapted the book into the screenplay, and Robert Rossen went on, of course, to direct and write The Hustler. Yeah. But Harry Brown's dialogue, when you read the book, word for word is what was adapted and placed in the movie. So in a sense, it is a play. It's one of the most, I think the two war movies, one about World War I called What Price Glory, based on a play, and Walk in the Sun, which feels like a play. And through the narrative, which is very verbal, you get a real sense of each of those characters.
Milestone made All Quiet on the Western Front, then A Walk in the Sun, and finally Pork Chop Hill. What did he have that set him apart, that had him make this trilogy of war films?
Well, I think of all the movies Milestone made, my favorite is A Walk in the Sun. In 1930, he made All Quiet on the Western Front. I believe it won the Academy Award for Best Picture.
It did.
That year. And Pork Chop Hill is an amazing film about the whole Panmunjom talks, the alleged peace talks that were happening while they were taking a hill, which was rather pointless. That's maybe the most anti-war film. Actually, the two anti-war bookends is All Quiet and Pork Chop Hill. Those are his two great anti-war statements. He also made Purple Heart, about the trial of downed aviators in Japan during World War II. But one of the things I love about Milestone visually is the way he moves his camera. He made famous the kind of horizontal dolly shot. As soldiers are running toward you, the camera just goes left to right or right to left. He does that in all of his pictures. Walk in the Sun is about a walk in the sun of Salerno, Italy.
Right, 6 miles from beach to bridge.
And there's a lot of walking. And there's an incredible music score. You know, there's a great song at the beginning of A Walk in the Sun by Earl Robinson. And it's one of my favorite parts of the film. There's a kind of musical ostinato, which essentially means sort of a rhythm track, you know, that I think the great composer Leonard Rosenman probably was influenced by, because a lot of Leonard's scores sound like the score to A Walk in the Sun. And that da-dun, 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 dun, dun, takes you on this journey eventually to the farmhouse, which is their final destination. And the great thing also about Walk in the Sun, and don't let this turn you off of watching the movie now, but a lot of the action takes place over a hill where you can't see anything. All you hear is the sound. And I think the brave choice of having Dana Andrews and Sterling Holloway sitting in a trench, and they hear a great aerial battle where planes are dive bombing ships, but all you see is smoke over the rise. You never see anything. And it wasn't really about saving money. I think it was really about, that's what war is like. Often you don't see anything.
Steven, great stuff. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Here's the film from 1945, directed by Louis Milestone, A Walk in the Sun. Welcome back, Ben Mankiewicz, our guest tonight, the man who has programmed our films, who has dealt with my deteriorating voice, like the pro that he is.
Medic,
yeah. Steven Spielberg, thank you.
Thank you.
In A Walk in the Sun,
yes,
you were struck by the performance of an actor named Herbert Rudley,
yes,
played Sergeant Porter, the sergeant who initially took over the unit, but then was suffering from battle fatigue, couldn't go on.
Yeah, what is often referred to as the 1,000-yard stare. And it was PTSD. And there's no indication early on that he is not going to be able to lead the squad to its objective. But very slowly, he starts to make decisions that everybody feels are not well thought through. And then you realize there's something desperately wrong within him, probably based on every other battle he's fought in up to that point. General Patton would have slapped him across the face, but his squad takes such good care of him. There's such kindness toward him.
Kindness is the word I think of with Milestone, Louis Milestone, the director,
yes,
in the film, because this was seen as a weakness by many Americans in 1945 if you didn't have the strength to power through this awfulness that you're experiencing. But even as he's lying there and he's crying before they leave him, whoever's sitting with him suggests, hey, it's okay. this is just one too many battles. You've seen too much.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Yeah. I experienced that as a kid growing up because my father, who fought in World War II, he was with the 490th Bomb Squadron in India and Burma, the Burma Bridge Busters, and he'd have reunions every couple of years with a lot of his mates. A lot of them saw more action than my dad did. And I'd be home, I'd be 12, 13 years old, and suddenly I'd hear crying from the living room. And I'd just sort of walk through to the kitchen and glance into the living room, and there were invariably 5 or 6 grown men with their arms around one of them who had broken down, recounting some of those, wartime experiences. So it's a very real thing. And this movie is one of the earliest films to really, face it head on.
So many great performances in the film, so many of them small. Which one struck you?
I think the performances between Richard Conte and George Tyne, who played Jake and Rivera, there is a kind of energy in that relationship. And Richard Conte has all these crazy philosophies. Everybody in Walk in the Sun has a moment of philosophy. Everyone has a little bumall that they toss out there, and even Burgess Meredith, who narrates the film. Everybody is kind of opining about the state of mind of war and wartime. And so in that sense, it's not 100% realistic, but the Conte relationship is it's one of the best parts of the film for me.
When you make a picture like Saving Private Ryan, are you aware that what you put on screen, such a seminal moment in American history, is going to influence how people imagine D-Day, right? I mean, those 25 minutes at the beginning of Saving Private Ryan, that's now what I think of when I think of D-Day. It's a pretty powerful responsibility.
Well, I've never been to war, and so I have no firsthand experiences. But I met as many veterans who landed on Dog Green, Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944, and the great historian Stephen Ambrose introduced me to a lot of them that were in his book, Citizen Soldier. And I really, owe so much to Stephen for introducing me to some of these men who were then, 17, 18, 19-year-old boys who told me what it was like at 6:30 in the morning landing in those Higgins boats on Omaha Beach. And I took those stories very seriously, and I listened to them, and I informed every single choice I made. I wanted them to see Private Ryan to say, that's exactly what it was like for me. So I wasn't thinking about referencing other war movies. I wasn't thinking about A Walk in the Sun. I was only thinking about what these veterans had told all of us about what it was like that morning.
Stephen, great stuff. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ben.
Don't go away. Stephen and I have one more film to present tonight. It's Francois Truffaut's 1973 look at the making of a film. Day for Night is next on TCM. Hello and welcome to TCM. I'm Ben Mankiewicz. Our guest tonight, the great Steven Spielberg. Steven, thank you for being here, programming these films and sharing your thoughts about them.
Yeah, this has been a lot of fun for me. Thank you.
Up next from 1973, Francois Truffaut's Day for Night. I think the best movie, not about making movies, about making a movie. One particular movie. Why'd you pick this film? What draws you to it?
I think this movie is one of the most accurate portrayals of what it's like to make one movie, telling one story, casting one film where nothing goes right. And which is so often the case.
And it's not like there's one big event, but it's a series of little problems that could disrupt the film in major ways.
I've always felt that filmmakers should never sweat the big stuff, but you got to sweat the small stuff. And Day for Night is about all the little small things that basically grow into one big problem that threatens the continuation of a movie. And it all has to do with personalities, conflicting, and people who are interested in more than just the professional job of working on a film, but interested in their own personal lives while the film is being made. That's the conundrum about Day for Night.
The performances here are so good, but I think the most notable is Francois Truffaut as the director, because he wasn't an actor, or certainly not trained as an actor. As he navigates all these problems that come up, you relate to that? Is that what a director has to do? Solve these little problems that could be big problems, the romantic troubles, the life troubles of cast members, a nagging wife of a production manager, all these things?
Well, I think a director has to not only solve some of the problems him or herself, but a director has to know who to go to. who knows how to solve the problem that is, basically relevant to their craft. And there's a lot of that in the film. There's also that unsung hero of what they call this, the continuity person. In this case, the script girl, as it used to be called, because many of them were women in those days. Natalie Bai plays the continuity person, who's kind of like, in a way, the muse of the director.
It seems like a much bigger role. She's offering him script ideas, too.
It really shows also what collaboration is all about. And you mentioned performances. There's some great performances in this film. Jean-Pierre Laude, who was in 400 Blows, plays often Truffaut's alter ego, and Jean-Pierre Armand, and the great Valentina Cortese, who was so good in Thieves Highway by Jules Dassin. Amazing in that film as well.
She was nominated for an Oscar, Best Supporting Actress, for this, too.
Yeah.
I was struck by Truffaut's character. He directs the film, but even when the cameras aren't rolling, you're directing, and not just planning the shots. I mean, he's directing by building up his actors, by helping them get through a scene. Valentina Cortese can't remember her lines in one scene, and she's humiliated by it.
Yeah.
There are breakdowns from the male lead. He's directing their emotions. He's getting them to the point where they can deliver their best performance or any performance.
Well, he's certainly creating a safe place where he doesn't humiliate or shame anyone for going up on their dialogue. And that great scene where Valentina cannot remember a single line. That happens to all of us.
Non, non, ça va aller très bien, Séverine. Ça va aller, vous savez. Ça va aller. On va arrêter un petit peu. Ça va aller.
Je sais pas qu'est-ce qu'il me passe. Peut-être que c'est la perruque qu'il met dans ma tête.
She can't even remember what door to open.
Which is hysterically funny, but it's also painfully accurate. But the scene that I always go back to is how hard it is to work with animals in movies. Trying to get the cat to drink the milk, and you'll see it in a second, is one of the standout performances of Day for Night.
All right, let's watch it. We'll talk more afterwards, including your decision to cast Francois Truffaut 4 years later in Close Encounters.
Yes.
Here's the film from 1973, directed by Francois Truffaut, starring Francois Truffaut, Day for Night. Welcome back. I'm joined once again by filmmaker Steven Spielberg. Steven's new film, The Fabelmans, up for 7 Academy Awards. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And your film, I mean, there's some similarities to Day for Night. I mean, you do make a movie inside the movie. You're making it as a teenager, but still, The Fabelmans is a film about the love of this craft, right? The love of cinema. And that's what Truffaut did when he made Day for Night.
And Day for Night, which is one of the reasons I picked it, because it's an experience I've had many, many times directing film. And it's also, I think, one of Truffaut's most freeing movies in his oeuvre. It's a film that I know, because I knew Truffaut. I directed him in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and he would really talk freely and openly about how much fun it was to make that movie.
Why did you hire Truffaut for Close Encounters?
I thought he was great in The Wild Child, and so I wrote the part for him, never thinking he'd say yes, and went to France to try to cast everybody but Truffaut, because I assumed he would just say no. He wouldn't work for another director. And I finally took a chance. I was very close to casting an actor. I won't mention who. He's still with us today. And before I went ahead and offered the part, I made a phone call to see if Truffaut would even consider reading the script. And he did. And he read the script, and I got a telegram in those days back from Francois Truffaut. Said, "Where do I report for costume fittings?" And then we had a great conversation about an hour later. That's how it all began.
That must have felt pretty good.
It was a great feeling. I thought I had secured a really good cast, and to have Truffaut in my movie was such an honor.
So I was talking recently to Harrison Ford, who opened up in a way I didn't expect. But in his talking about how much he loved the craft of acting, what drew him to it was the very thing that you see at the end of Day for Night. Is not so much the parting, but this moment of intensity that you share with these other artists.
Yes.
With the crew, with the director, and with the other cast members. And then it's over. And you go on,
Yes.
you move to something else, and it's part of these different lives that you lead.
Unless you work awfully hard to keep your movie family together as a real living, group of family and friends, it is the only business in the world when you say goodbye, you mean goodbye. Everybody goes on to other projects, and in good fortune, you see each other again when you do the press tour or even during award season. But most of the time, that's it, and you become so close emotionally to everybody on that set, including members of the crew and everybody on the crew. It becomes a real tight family, and then all of a sudden, it's over. And you have a final fling, which is called the wrap party. And there's a lot of tears usually and a lot of drinking. And at the end of that, sometimes you only, are able to reunite with 10% of the people you just worked with for the last 4 months.
I'm going to guess that wrap, that conclusion on The Fabelmans might have been harder for you than most wrap parties. I'm sure they're all hard. But this was such an intensely personal story. It was your story of how you became a filmmaker. Was that true? Was the parting on The Fabelmans trickier than other films?
Well, it was trickier because I had just lost my father a year before. I lost my mother about 3 years before I made the picture. And so when I had to say goodbye to Michelle Williams, who plays Mitzi, AKA my mom, and Paul Dano, who plays Bert, AKA my dad, it was like saying goodbye to my parents for a second time. That was hard.
It's a wonderful film. Thanks for making it.
Thank you.
Thanks for sharing the story of how Steven Spielberg became Steven Spielberg with the rest of us. I appreciate it. And thanks for dealing with my voice tonight.
It's great. You're at a very good octave level right now to do a lot of good voiceovers.
Fantastic. Steven Spielberg, everybody, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Stay with us. Good stuff continues on TCM, and as always, it is uncut and commercial-free.